In the heart of a seemingly peaceful Florida suburb, where palm trees swayed gently in the breeze and the sun kissed pastel-colored rooftops, an invisible yet palpable division snaked through the tree-lined streets. It wasn't a physical boundary like a river or a wall, but a line drawn by ideologies, by worldviews as distinct as the red and blue that colored electoral maps. In that landscape of well-kept houses and immaculate lawns, political polarization in the United States wasn't just a distant debate on television. It seeped into barbecue conversations, glances exchanged in the supermarket line, and, more insidiously, into the relationships between neighbors. It was a microcosm of a nation in conflict, where the search for common ground seemed like an increasingly distant utopia. And at the center of this boiling cauldron of tension, two families, separated by far more than a hedge, were about to have their lives intertwined by an unexpected love, one that would challenge the barriers of prejudice and ideology. In the corner house, with a vibrant garden and an equality flag fluttering discreetly on the porch, lived the Davis family. Simone Davis, a woman in her early 40s with dark, gleaming skin like polished ebony, had an imposing stature, but her broad shoulders carried the weight of a life dedicated to social justice. Her hair, cut short and streaked with gray at the temples, framed an expressive face, where worry lines blended with the soft lines of a warm and welcoming smile. Her eyes, deep and penetrating brown, reflected sharp intelligence and genuine compassion, but also a subtle weariness, born of years fighting for a more equitable world. Simone was a history professor at a local university, and her passion for unraveling the complexities of the past was matched only by her commitment to shaping a more just future. Morally, she was a beacon of integrity, and tireless advocate for civil rights, racial equality, and inclusion. Her moral compass always pointed toward empathy and solidarity, and she firmly believed in the power of dialogue and education to bridge divides. Psychologically, Simone was a critical thinker, a pragmatic idealist who, despite disappointments, never lost faith in humanity's capacity to evolve. She was patient and reflective, yet possessed an unshakable inner strength when it came to defending her principles. At her side, Isabella Rodriguez, her wife, was the embodiment of grace and resilience. Also in her early 40s, Isabella possessed a striking beauty, with warm, olive-toned skin and long, wavy hair that cascaded over her shoulders. Her almond-shaped, expressive eyes radiated a serene calm, but also a steely determination. She was a family therapist, and her profession had endowed her with a rare ability to listen, to understand the nuances of human relationships, and to guide people through their conflicts. Isabella was the anchor, the voice of reason in the midst of storms, the quiet force that kept everything in balance. Morally, she was guided by a profound sense of justice and fairness, but her approach was more subtle, focused more on healing and reconciliation than direct confrontation. She believed that true change began in the heart of every individual and in each person's ability to step into another's shoes. Psychologically, Isabella was empathetic, intuitive, and possessed remarkable emotional intelligence. She was the bridge, the mediator, the peacemaker, always striving to understand the motivations behind actions and words, even the most painful ones. They were the mothers of Elijah Davis, a 17-year-old who embodied both the hope and the complexity of his generation. Elijah was tall and slender, with bronzed skin and coiled hair that he wore in a modern, relaxed style. His eyes, inherited from Simone, were expressive and full of life, but also carried a subtle melancholy, a reflection of the tensions he perceived in the world around him. He was a born artist, with a special talent for music and poetry, and his art was his refuge, his way of processing life's complexities. He was introspective, but with a vibrant soul and an open heart. Morally, he was an idealist, deeply influenced by the values of his mother's, but with a worldview of his own, more fluid and less dogmatic. He believed in the beauty of diversity and in the importance of building bridges between people regardless of their differences. Psychologically, Elijah was sensitive, observant, and possessed a remarkable capacity for empathy. He deeply felt the injustices of the world, and his response was art, creation, the pursuit of beauty and meaning amid chaos. He was the embodiment of a new generation, one that, despite the divisions, still dreamed of a future built on unity and understanding. Elijah had been conceived through artificial insemination, a fact his mother's always addressed with naturalness and pride, celebrating the science and love that made their family possible. Across the street, in a house with a perfectly manicured lawn and a large American flag flying from a tall pole, lived the Miller family. Robert Miller, a man in his early 50s with fair skin and a face weathered by years under the Florida sun, had a sturdy build and an upright posture that suggested a certain rigidity. His thinning light brown hair was always combed back, and his blue eyes, though sometimes friendly, could turn cold and distant when the subject shifted to politics or social issues. Robert was a successful businessman in the construction industry, and his life was governed by traditional values: hard work, patriotism, and an unshakable belief in individualism. Morally, he saw himself as a man of principle, a defender of freedom and order, but his worldview was often limited by deeply rooted biases and a profound mistrust of anything he considered different or threatening to his values. Psychologically, Robert was a man of strong convictions, resistant to change and new ideas, and tended to see the world in black and white, right or wrong, with little room for nuance or complexity. He was a leader in his community, respected for his work ethic, but feared for his inflexibility. By his side, Susan Miller, his wife, was the embodiment of the traditional American housewife. Also in her early 50s, Susan possessed a classic beauty, with well-maintained blonde hair and blue eyes that, while kind, carried a certain air of naivety. She devoted her life to her family and her church, and her daily routine was filled with volunteer work and social events. Susan was a woman of faith, and her morality was shaped by religious teachings and the conservative values instilled in her from childhood. She was affectionate and attentive with her family and friends, but her worldview was confined within a social bubble that rarely opened to the other. Psychologically, Susan was a good-hearted woman, but easily influenced by her husband's opinions and those of her social circle. She avoided conflict and preferred to maintain peace at any cost, even if it meant ignoring uncomfortable realities or truths. They were the parents of Olivia Miller, a 17-year-old girl who was the embodiment of her parents' expectations and her own search for identity. Olivia was slender and graceful, with long blonde hair that fell in waves over her shoulders, and blue eyes that, at times, revealed a depth and sensitivity that contrasted with the all-American girl image she projected. She was a dedicated student with a special talent for writing and literature, and her life revolved around studying, reading, and the pressure of living up to her parents' expectations. She was observant, but she carried a latent curiosity and a desire to understand the world beyond the borders of her own bubble. She was in the process of formation, absorbing her parents' values, but also quietly questioning them. She was loyal to her family and her friends, but was beginning to feel the weight of the contradictions and hypocrisies she observed around her. Psychologically, Olivia was a young woman in transition, seeking her own voice in the midst of a chorus of pre-established opinions. She was sensitive, observant, and possessed a capacity for empathy that often brought her into conflict with her family's more rigid views. She was the personification of youth that, despite divisions, still sought truth and connection in an increasingly polarized world. The suburb, with its apparent homogeneity, was in fact a melting pot of unlikely encounters. Elijah and Olivia, though neighbors, lived in parallel worlds, separated by the invisible but powerful ideological and racial barriers their families represented. Yet fate, or perhaps the casual randomness of suburban life, had other plans for them. Their first meaningful encounter happened at a community event, a summer festival at the local park, where loud music and the smell of barbecue unsuccessfully tried to mask the underlying tensions. Elijah was on stage, strumming his guitar and singing one of his original songs, a soft melody with lyrics that spoke of unity and understanding. His voice, melancholy and powerful, echoed through the park, drawing the attention of many. Olivia, standing with her parents near the craft booth, felt unexplainably drawn to the music. She wasn't a fan of alternative music, as her father liked to call it, but something in Elijah's voice captivated her, a sincerity that resonated deep in her soul. Almost unconsciously, she drifted away from her parents and approached the stage,
watching Elijah with a curiosity that surprised her even herself. After the performance, Elijah stepped down from the stage, and Olivia, pushed by a courage she didn't know she had, approached him. She complimented his music, and their conversation flowed surprisingly easily. They discovered shared interests, a passion for literature, though Olivia was the avid reader and Elijah the poet, a love of science fiction films, and a mutual curiosity about each other's world. The differences in their realities, which for their parents seemed like an unbridgeable chasm, became fertile ground for discovery. They met in secret over the following days, in cafes, the library, and hidden corners of the park, building a friendship that quickly grew into something deeper. Their first kiss, shy and filled with innocent sweetness, happened under the moonlight on a secluded park bench, a silent vow that for them, love knew no zip codes or skin colors. But the bubble of innocence surrounding them wouldn't last forever. Though the families were neighbors, they kept a respectful but heavily loaded distance, filled with unspoken prejudice. The Davises, with their progressive stance, saw the Millers as the embodiment of the conservatism they so often criticized, a symbol of America unwilling to evolve. The Millers, in turn, viewed the Davises with a mix of suspicion and condescension, an example of what they considered the liberal agenda threatening traditional values. Racial tension, though rarely expressed outright, lingered in the air, an elephant in the room no one dared to mention. The romance between Elijah and Olivia, which to them felt like the most natural thing in the world, was about to become the catalyst for an emotional and ideological explosion that would test the limits of their families and the entire community.
The love between Elijah and Olivia blossomed in secret, a private garden where the colors of red and blue blended into shades of purple, a fusion that defied the logic of the outside world. They spent hours together, sharing dreams, fears, and the complexities of their lives. Elijah introduced Olivia to a world of art, music, and social activism, while Olivia shared with Elijah her passion for literature, the depth of words, and the beauty of stories. They completed each other, filling the gaps in one another's lives, building a connection that seemed unbreakable. However, the bubble of privacy that surrounded them was doomed to burst. The suburb, with its intricate web of gossip and observation, didn't allow secrets to last long. The first to suspect something was Susan Miller, Olivia's mother. She noticed her daughter's frequent outings, dreamy smiles, and a shift in behavior. Her maternal instinct, coupled with unease toward the Davis family, led her to investigate. One day, after following Olivia, she saw them together, holding hands in a distant cafe. The shock was immediate. A mix of disbelief and panic. Her daughter, her Olivia, with the son of the Davises, the liberal and different family on the street? The news spread like wildfire. Susan confronted Robert, her husband, who reacted with barely contained yet palpable fury. To Robert, this was more than a teenage romance. It was an affront to his values, a betrayal of his ideology, and more profoundly, a threat to his worldview. The racial issue, which he had long tried to ignore, now erupted with overwhelming force. He couldn't accept that his daughter, his heir, would be involved with one of them. The Miller home, once a refuge of order and tradition, turned into a battlefield filled with heated arguments and veiled accusations. Latent homophobia also came to light as Robert and Susan expressed their discomfort and disapproval toward Elijah's family structure, calling it non-traditional and unnatural. In the Davis household, the reaction was different, but no less complex. Simone and Isabella, though progressive and open-minded, held no racial prejudice against Olivia. They knew not all white people were racist. Still, a flicker of concern arose. They were aware of the racial and ideological tensions that surrounded the suburb and feared the veiled racism and homophobia of the Millers, who, while claiming not to be racist, supported ideas and policies that perpetuated discrimination and intolerance. Their concern was the impact such ideology could have on Elijah's relationship and his life. Their priority was Elijah's happiness and safety. They spoke with him, voicing their concerns, but also reaffirming their unconditional support. Elijah, in turn, defended his love with a passion that surprised his mother's.
He explained that Olivia was different, that she saw beyond appearances, that their love was real. The Davis family, though apprehensive about the situation, chose to support their son, aware that the journey ahead would be difficult, but convinced that true love deserved to be defended. Olivia, on her side, felt no tension from Elijah's mothers. In fact, she felt welcomed and understood, something that stood in strong contrast to the atmosphere in her own home. The suburb, once a place of appearances and silence, was forced to confront its own divisions. The romance between Elijah and Olivia became the talk of the town, a catalyst for heated debates, the exposure of veiled prejudices, and the reaffirmation of ideologies. The families, once separated by a hedge, now stood on opposite sides of an abyss, with their children in the middle, trying to build a bridge over the turbulent waters of intolerance and prejudice. The innocence of young love was about to be tested by the harsh reality of a world unwilling to accept the fusion of red and blue. The discovery of Elijah and Olivia's relationship turned the Davis and Miller households into emotional and ideological battlegrounds. For the Millers, the situation was a personal affront, a betrayal of the values Robert held so dearly. He saw the relationship as a conspiracy, an attempt to undermine his authority and corrupt his daughter with dangerous ideas. Arguments in the Miller home became frequent and intense. Robert, with his deep and imposing voice, tried to impose his will, ranting about society's moral decay, the threat diversity posed, and the importance of protecting the family from outside influences. The Millers' homophobia became more explicit, with derogatory remarks about Elijah's family and the abnormality of his upbringing. Susan, though gentler, supported her husband at the core, worried about what the neighbors might say and about their daughter's reputation. Olivia, meanwhile, felt suffocated. The home that was once her safe haven now felt like a prison of expectations and judgment. She tried to argue, tried to explain her feelings, but her words were drowned out by her father's fiery rhetoric. With each attempt to defend herself, the barrier between her and her parents grew taller, solidifying into a wall of incomprehension. At the Davis house, the atmosphere was different, but no less tense. Simone and Isabella, though more open to dialogue, felt Elijah's pain and the injustice of the situation. They tried to protect him, but also encouraged him to fight for his love. Their conversations were thoughtful, but heavy with deep sadness. Simone, with her background in history and social justice, tried to give Elijah historical context, explaining the roots of prejudice and polarization, including homophobia. Isabella, with her therapeutic wisdom, tried to calm emotions, offering a safe space for Elijah to express his frustration and pain. Still, concerns for Elijah's safety and the ongoing threat of hostility from the Millers loomed over the household, turning everyday life into an exercise in resilience. With every sideways glance, every veiled comment, every sign of disapproval from the house next door, the Davis family felt the weight of intolerance, and beneath their apparent calm, a quiet revolt began to boil. The tensions weren't limited to the homes. The suburb, once a haven of tranquility, became a stage for the manifestation of polarization. Neighbors who once exchanged pleasantries now avoided each other. Whispers and judgmental looks became commonplace. The community became divided, some siding with the Millers, others siding with the Davises, and most choosing silence, afraid to take a side. The romance between Elijah and Olivia, which should have been a love story, became a symbol of division, a mirror reflecting the deep fractures in American society. With each passing day, the distance between the families grew, and the hope for common ground diminished, swallowed up by the rising tide of intolerance and prejudice. The innocence of young love was being crushed under the weight of a world that refused to yield, refused to see beyond colors and ideologies.
The growing pressure on Elijah and Olivia began to take its toll. Their secret meetings became more difficult, their conversations more strained, and the initial joy of their love was gradually replaced by a feeling of suffocation. Olivia, torn between loyalty to her family and love for Elijah, felt torn apart. She tried to mediate,
to make her parents understand, but her efforts were in vain. With each argument, each ultimatum from her father, the flame of her hope seemed to fade. Elijah, in turn, felt Olivia's pain, but also growing frustration and anger at the injustice. He saw racial and ideological prejudice and homophobia in action, and it enraged him. He didn't want their love to be a battlefield, but it seemed there was no other choice. The breaking point came during a school event, prom. Elijah and Olivia, defying expectations and disapproving stares, decided to attend together. They wanted to show the world that their love was real, that they would not bow to hate and prejudice. Their arrival at the dance caused a stir. Some students supported them, others looked on with curiosity, and a minority, heavily influenced by their parents, greeted them with hostility. A night meant to be one of celebration turned into a cauldron of emotions. At the height of the evening, a trivial incident triggered the perfect storm. A group of Olivia's friends, under the influence of alcohol and their parents' ideas, began making derogatory comments about Elijah and their relationship. Their words, laden with racial prejudice, homophobia, and innuendos about race mixing and Elijah's non-traditional family, hit them like punches. Olivia, who had first tried to ignore it, could no longer contain herself. She confronted the group, defending Elijah with a fury that shocked everyone. The argument quickly escalated into a heated shouting match. Yelling broke out, and chaos erupted in the ballroom. The parents, who were in a separate area of the venue, were alerted. Robert Miller, seeing his daughter in a fight with Elijah, exploded. He stormed in, not to break it up, but to confront Elijah, shouting words laced with hatred, racial slurs, and homophobia. Simone and Isabella Davis, upon seeing their son being attacked both verbally and physically, intervened, and the argument between the parents became as fiery as the one between the students. The scene was a microcosm of the polarization tearing the country apart. Two families, divided by ideology, race, and sexual orientation, in a violent confrontation, with their children caught in the middle, paying the price for intolerance. The night ended with school security intervening, the suspension of those involved, and the painful certainty that the invisible line between the families had become an unbridgeable chasm. The prom incident had devastating consequences for everyone involved. Elijah and Olivia were suspended from school, and Olivia's once bright academic future was now in jeopardy. The family's reputations were stained, and the suburb, once merely divided, was now ablaze. The local media reported the events, turning the young couple's romance into a symbol of polarization, racial prejudice, and homophobia. Elijah and Olivia's story became a case study, an example of what happens when hatred and intolerance overcome empathy and dialogue. For the Millers, the incident confirmed their worst fears. In his rage, Robert forbade Olivia from seeing Elijah, threatening to disown her if she disobeyed. The Miller home became a toxic environment, where silence was heavy, and when words were spoken, they were full of resentment. Olivia, feeling trapped and betrayed by her own parents, began to pull away. She refused to yield, refused to give up her love, even if it meant losing everything she had known. Her relationship with her parents deteriorated to the point of becoming unbearable. She felt like a stranger in her own home, a prisoner of an ideology that no longer represented her. For the Davises, the pain was deep, but their determination was even greater. They supported Elijah unconditionally, helping him deal with the consequences of his suspension and the media exposure. Simone and Isabella, now more than ever, became vocal advocates for justice and equality, using their voices to denounce prejudice, intolerance, and homophobia. They knew the battle ahead would be long, but they were ready to face it. Still, the hostility from the Millers and part of the community began to affect the family's daily life. Simone received veiled threats at work, and Isabella had clients cancel their sessions. The Davis family, once respected, was now viewed with suspicion by some and with solidarity by others. The invisible line that once divided the families had become a solid, unmovable wall, and the hope of reconciliation now seemed farther away than ever. Despite all adversity, Elijah and Olivia tried to keep their love alive. They met in secret, in even more remote places, seeking refuge in one another. Their love, once innocent and joyful, had become an act of resistance, a challenge to norms and prejudices. They knew the path ahead would be difficult, but with every obstacle, every look of disapproval, every word of hate, their love seemed to grow stronger. They were living proof that empathy and human connection could bloom even in the arid soil of polarization. And yet the question remained: how long could they hold on? And what would be the final cost of their love in such a divided world?
Even in the midst of the darkness of intolerance, a glimmer of hope began to emerge, small and fragile, but full of potential. The story of Elijah and Olivia, though painful, did not go unnoticed. Media coverage, initially focused on sensationalism, began to shift in tone. Some journalists and commentators started to question the polarization, prejudice, and homophobia that had led to the incident. Articles and editorials began discussing the importance of dialogue, empathy, and understanding in an increasingly divided society. The young couple's story became a catalyst for difficult but necessary conversations about race, ideology, sexual orientation, and the future of the United States. At school, the suspension of Elijah and Olivia sparked heated debate among students. Many felt inspired by the couple's courage and began to question the attitudes of their own parents and the community. A group of students, led by friends of Elijah and Olivia, organized a support movement promoting discussions about diversity, inclusion, and respect. They created a dialogue club where students from different backgrounds and ideologies could gather to talk, listen, and learn from one another. The school, once a reflection of the suburb's divisions, began to transform into a space of learning and bridge building. For Olivia, the support from her friends and the growing awareness at school brought relief. She realized she was not alone, that there were people who understood and supported her. This realization gave her the strength to make a difficult decision. She confronted her parents once again, not with anger, but with a calm and determination that surprised them. She explained that she could not live in a home filled with hate and prejudice, that her love for Elijah was real, and that she would not give it up. She said that if they couldn't accept it, she would have to leave. The threat of losing their daughter, of seeing their family fall apart, hit Robert and Susan in a way no previous argument had. Robert's rigidity began to soften, and Susan, with tears in her eyes, recognized the depth of her daughter's pain. At the Davis home, resilience and faith in justice began to bear fruit. Simone and Isabella, with the support of colleagues and activists, organized a community forum on polarization, prejudice, and homophobia. They invited experts, religious leaders, and community members to discuss these issues openly and constructively. At first, attendance was small, but gradually more people began to show up, curious, apprehensive, but willing to listen. Elijah and Olivia's story served as the backdrop, a constant reminder of the cost of intolerance. The forum became a space for dialogue, for the exchange of ideas, and for building common ground. The seed of change had been planted, and though the road ahead was long and difficult, hope for a more just and inclusive future had begun to bloom. The Florida suburb did not transform overnight into a utopia of harmony and understanding,
The scars of polarization, prejudice, and homophobia were deep, and healing would take time. However, the story of Elijah and Olivia, with all its pain and resilience, had ignited a flame. The fight at prom, though tragic, served as a catalyst, forcing the community to confront its own divisions and question the cost of intolerance. Robert and Susan Miller, though still wrestling with their own prejudices, began to take small steps toward acceptance. The threat of losing Olivia, of watching their family collapse, was a sobering wake-up call. Susan, in particular, began attending family therapy sessions with Isabella Rodriguez, seeking to better understand herself and the dynamics within her home. Robert, though reluctant, began to listen more, to question his own assumptions. Acceptance didn't happen all at once, but through small gestures, a less hostile glance, a softer word, a quiet acknowledgement of their daughter's pain. They still had a long way to go, but the seed of empathy had been planted. Elijah and Olivia, in turn, remained beacons of hope. They became activists in their own community, using their story to promote dialogue and understanding. They spoke on panels, gave interviews, and Elijah continued to use his music and poetry to express the importance of unity and acceptance. Their love, once a secret, had become an inspiration, a testament to the human capacity to overcome division. They were not naive. They knew that prejudice, intolerance, and homophobia would not disappear overnight. But they believed that through empathy, dialogue, and the courage to love, it was possible to build a world where differences were celebrated, not feared. The red zip code and the blue zip code, once symbols of division, had begun to blend, creating new shades, new possibilities. Elijah and Olivia's story wasn't just about teenage love. It was about the struggle for a future in which skin color, political ideology, and sexual orientation no longer determined a person's worth. It was about the ability to see the other not as an enemy, but as a human being, with their own hopes, fears, and dreams. It was about the belief that even in a polarized world, empathy can be the bridge that connects us, the force that unites us, and love the most powerful revolution of all. If you were moved by Elijah and Olivia's story, if you felt the strength of love overcoming the walls of prejudice, and if you believe that empathy can build bridges where there once were only abysses, then this message is for you. Polarization is real, but so is unity. Share this story, leave your reflections, and if you haven't already, subscribe to the channel and leave a like so that more stories like this can reach hearts and minds, inspiring the change we so desperately need. Together, we can build a future where love and understanding prevail over hate and division. Your voice matters. Let's walk this journey together.